All right. Hi, everyone. We'll just give a moment for folks to sign on.
And as we wait, we would love to hear where you are joining from. If you wouldn't mind in the chat, first putting your settings to everyone, not just hosts and panelists, and letting us know where you're visiting from. Hi, Annie.
Hi, hi, Annie.
Hey, we got a couple people from Durham, North Carolina, Cincinnati,
Natty.
Bloomington.
Great. All right. This is always one of my favorite parts of the program is seeing where everyone is tuning in from. So let's get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Kat Lloyd. I'm the Tenement Museum's Vice President of Programs and Interpretation. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's edition of Tenement Tuesdays. If you were with us last week, you know that this winter we're doing a series where we answer our visitors' most common questions by bringing in scholars and historians to help answer some of the things that we hear very frequently on tours of the Tenement Museum. So last week we talked about what is a tenement with historic preservationist Andrew Dolkart. Tonight we're going to sort of dig into the story of the model minority myth with historian Dr. Ellen Wu. And we are joined tonight by Dr. Ellen Wu. But what we'll do is actually watch a interview that I was lucky enough to do with Dr. Wu about a month ago. And then Dr. Wu will come on and answer your questions live. So we're trying this new format. We're really excited to see how it goes, hear your questions. And of course, throughout, if you have other questions that you think would make a good topic for one of these programs, please also let us know. So we want to hear your questions about Dr. Wu's work and what we'll be talking about tonight. But we also, of course, want to hear your ideas for future programs. You all are really what inspires us to create these programs. Your questions and the comments and connections you make on our Tenement Museum programs help fuel new research, help us connect new historians, and really keep this work alive. So thank you so much for your support, both intellectual support and also your financial support of these programs. These programs are free, and we hope that you will continue to join us for these conversations as we move through the rest of the series. So I'll formally introduce Dr. Wu and then turn it over to Dolan to just let you know a little bit of housekeeping for the program tonight. So tonight we're going to hear from Dr. Ellen Wu, who's an associate professor of history at Indiana University, Bloomington. So we do indeed have someone joining us from Bloomington, Indiana. And she's also the author of The Color of Success, Asian Americans and the Model Minority Myth. So I'll turn it over to Dolan to let us know how we will keep in touch tonight, and then we will get going with the program.
Thanks, Kat. I just want to echo her sentiment. We are so glad to have you all here and really excited to hear from you. I am here to provide general support. So if there's any tech issues with the live stream, let us know right away in the chat and we will troubleshoot. And I'm here to answer your questions that might come up about the museum, about the buildings that are part of the museum, about the family stories that we tell throughout the broadcast of the interview. I will collect them. I will answer what I can and also pass off your questions to Dr. Wu during the Q&A. It is a webinar, so the cameras are not enabled, voice chat is not enabled, but we really, really do want to hear from you. So please put any thoughts, comments, questions in the chat. I will be monitoring it the whole time. And I think that's about it for me.
Great. All right. Thanks, Dolan. Okay, so again, we will be joined by Dr. Wu in about a half an hour when we finish the interview and look forward to hearing your questions then. over the years that we've been sharing the Wong story, we have had visitors kind of wonder sort of how the Wong story fits into this bigger story of Asian Americans, and especially once visitors, if they weren't familiar, once they learn about kind of the impact of Chinese exclusion and that legacy, sort of wondering how we get from the period of exclusion in the 1880s to the Wong story in the 1960s and beyond. And so your work so clearly outlines kind of that evolution and some of the ways to think about, storytelling and the importance of storytelling in thinking about any immigrant community, but particularly, your book highlights Chinese and Japanese American communities. And so, to start out, let's just, if folks are not familiar, or maybe they've heard the term model minority and haven't always been sure kind of what it means, like how do you understand kind of what this term means?
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you, Kat, and everybody at the Tenement Museum. It's just really delightful and such an honor to be here with you and the audience. So to answer your question, this phrase model minority, it might not be familiar to everybody, or you might have actually heard about it a lot, especially when it comes to Asian Americans. I consider it's kind of like a brand or a stereotype, or I sometimes think of it as a bucket. And inside that bucket are all these sort of attributes or characteristics, and they all sound, I would say, really positive. It's a racial minority group that's usually, not white or like maybe not sort of waspy, that is thought to be widely held to be well assimilated, upwardly mobile. In the case of Asian Americans, it also usually tends to mean that they work hard and they have certain kinds of cultural characteristics that allows them to succeed in American life. And related to that also is this presumption, I guess, or this assumption that they do it not by complaining or making noise or protesting, but that they keep their heads down and they don't rock the boat. And so that is all of those ideas are kind of stuffed into this like very short phrase, model minority, but that's what it conjures up.
And right, so that it's really this whole constellation of stereotypes or assumptions that, in your work, you really start with this question of like, where did this come from, and how do we go from within American society, this era of Chinese exclusion, to then this model minority myth. And so throughout the conversation, we will kind of debunk that a little bit, and also kind of trace, as you do in your book, kind of the evolution and emergence of this myth.
Great.
And so, for the Wong story, when we share their story on our tour, we actually pair, as you saw yesterday, we pair their story with a story of a German Jewish family in the 1870s. And so, we actually, get to look at how New York's Chinatown is one of the oldest immigrant communities here, and there are Chinese immigrants coming here in the mid 19th century. So that by the time the Wongs are coming in the mid 20th century, we've had many decades of kind of shifts and changes, for Chinese New Yorkers, and so. Before we kind of get into the origins of the model minority myth, I'm hoping we can kind of set the scene for like this period of Asian exclusion, if people aren't familiar. So what was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and kind of what were the specifications of that?
Sure. Okay. So I'll try to see how I can do on this one. So I think of exclusion as far as Chinese American history. We can think about it as an era, if there are any Taylor Swift people in the audience. So there's an exclusion era. And in this era, exclusion is sort of this, it's like a goal or an ambition that really drives U.S. policy, right? But it's also, I think, really comes out of a set of cultural assumptions, again, and ideas and practices, and the way that people treat each other, like face to face on the streets, right? So you have culture, you have society, and then you have economy and politics, and those all come together. And so I think we can peel this back really to the California gold rush. So we start with 1849 and then 1850s. The gold rush really drew people from all over the world to the Pacific coast of the United States to, strike it rich. And the Chinese themselves, who were part of the gold rush, people coming from China, in Cantonese, right? People referred to, or Toisanese, the United States and San Francisco and California, sort of like the gold mountain, right? So that was their ambition. And after the gold mines were, picked through, a lot of the Chinese workers stayed, and they ended up doing other kinds of work in the American West, building railroads, agriculture, and eventually moving into service economy as well, right? So laundries, restaurants. And the thing is, we want to remember at that time, the American West was a really volatile place for lots of different reasons. First, of course, they're indigenous lands, but as white Americans, undertook westward expansion, and so once the Chinese started to arrive, and the Chinese themselves seemed different enough. And so what I tell my students in the classroom is that the Chinese became an easy target for white workers in the West to express their frustrations and insecurities, right? Again, it's a lot of economic volatility and uncertainty. I think because outwardly, the Chinese looked and acted differently in a cultural sense. They dressed differently, they ate different kinds of food, they practiced different kinds of religions. Mostly they came as young, able-bodied men, so they didn't really have upstanding, middle-class family households, and that difference eventually became thought of as, very dangerous. Okay, and so historians like May Nai, etc., have worked a lot on this period, and that concept, right, of this dangerous difference, then began to fuel a series of policies at local, state, and then eventually federal levels, targeting the migration and entry, essentially trying to stop the entry of Chinese workers into the United States, right? So, and this again accrues over time. There's one in 1875 that's mostly aimed at Chinese women who are thought to be sex workers, and then by 1882 you have the first of those Chinese Exclusion Acts that again are restricting the entry of laborers. And then on top of that, there are then a series of other federal laws as well as court cases that reaffirm and really kind of set the template for immigration policy as a whole, right? That the federal government and Congress in particular has that authority to make the rules, and also, due to essentially national security concerns, that the United States has the right to deport people as well. So a lot of those practices that we have in place today come out of that original Chinese exclusion period.
Right, absolutely. And that the Chinese Exclusion Act is one of the first federal immigration laws, right? And that, as you were saying, over the subsequent decades, there would be, continual legislation that would further restrict. And that culminates, right, in 1924 with the Johnson-Reed Act that we talk about on our tour, where we talk about an Italian family where the mother of the family is undocumented because of the impact of Johnson-Reed and this new quota system that goes in place. But the part that we don't often talk about as much about the Johnson-Reed Act is that that fully shuts the doors to Asian immigration, right? That creates this kind of category of quote unquote aliens ineligible to citizenship and barring their entry completely. And so, right, you see these sort of 4 decades of, of restriction. And during that period, right, just so that we can contrast then with sort of this positive stereotype that you write about, there's very negative stereotyping, of course, of, Asian Americans, Chinese Americans.
Oh, absolutely, right. They were thought to be really, if we let them in, being the Chinese, the United States, it would be, the gateway to the fall of American or Western civilization, right? Again, because they had very different cultural habits, and just sort of became this kind of vilified, I guess, figure. This kind of Like people projected all these worries and anxieties, and the Chinese were an easy target because under exclusion laws, immigrants could not become U.S. citizens, right? So they don't have that political opportunity to elect officials that might be more responsive to their needs. Yeah. So it really, in some ways, it was a really important kind of prototype about how to be very stringent about who, or like how to curate a population that you want to have, you know.
And so then, right, the kind of proverbial doors closed completely in 1924. And then as you write in your book, it's not really until the World War II era that, the picture starts to change. And, you're sort of mentioning the kind of image of American society or Western civilization, and kind of that American image during World War II really plays a role in then changing policy, right? That it's kind of the United States, trying to position itself as a, global democracy, as a superpower. We're fighting fascism abroad. Then looking at our own policies, and so then what changes, in that World War II period, for after decades of this exclusion era? How is policy changing during World War II?
Yeah, so I think in some ways, the more I think about World War II, the more I realize, we cannot underestimate the importance of World War II being this major turning point. Precisely because the United States has these global ambitions to be essentially become the leader of the free world, right? Which we see by the height of the mid-century, and fighting these wars against fascism, against Nazis, really then does force U.S. leaders to really take a hard look at their own policies of how they treat various religious and racial ethnic minorities here at home. And I will say that, I really do believe that it is because of the insistence of Black Americans to hold the United States to its professed ideals, freedom, equality, democracy. So as that kind of moment of what historians refer to as this modern civil rights really ramps up with World War II, it has some profound implications for Asian Americans. So it's really a tricky situation for various Asian groups because we really see at this moment how so much of how Asian Americans are treated here in the United States is really closely linked to the U.S. relationship with their country of origin. So for the Chinese, it's a huge opportunity because now China is the United States' most important ally in the Asia Pacific, right? In this war against the Axis powers. And so for the Chinese, that means Congress decides to repeal the series of exclusion laws against the Chinese in 1943. But it's really, I would say, it's more for show, I guess, because they only then kind of agree to let 105 people of Chinese ancestry into the country per year. So I always, again,
and that's because of that quota system, right?
Yes.
We talk about that of there's
from
a quota
from
1924,
Yes.
and so it's really just
It's a token, right? Because I tell my students, I have a class right now, there's 70 students. So it's barely more than the people we have in the classroom, right? If you think about how small that is. But it's a symbolic gesture of goodwill. It also meant that because the United States needed people to fight in the armed forces, they needed people to work the defense industries, to build, planes and tanks and ships. These are then also hugely important opportunities for Chinese Americans who had tended to be really kind of residentially, but also sort of labor market segregated in U.S. Chinatowns. It is really, I think, the first time that these opportunities really begin to open up. And one of my favorite quotes is from this period, a very famous progressive advocate named Carey McWilliams in California. He has this quote I love. He said, "The war has brought the Chinese out of Chinatown and we should lock the doors behind them." It's a very dramatic quote, but you can kind of see there's this moment of excitement that Chinese Americans now think, we may finally have this chance to be treated as full members of American society.
Right, as full Americans.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think, so important to share that quote, and really connects to what I was so struck by in the way you write about kind of this era as an emancipation, right? That kind of remembering all of the dimensions and aspects of discrimination in housing, in jobs, in participation in the political process, or at least voting, right? People were being politically active even if they couldn't vote. That's important to remember. But I was really struck by your use of the word emancipation for like what was sort of happening in this period,
Right.
or at least the way people were starting to imagine what was seeming more possible.
Right. And so that phrase has come from a Chinese American sociologist of the time, her word, and she described this moment as emancipation. Her name is Rose Hum Lee. She was a sociology professor. But yes, I think that's how dramatic of a moment I think it really was for Chinese in the United States. This is this sort of sudden turning point, you know.
And did she use that word kind of with the intention of making that connection to the experience of Black Americans?
You know, I'm not sure. That's a great question.
We didn't practice this, but I was like, I wonder.
I did. I wonder too. I wish we could ask her, but I'm also certain that she would have been very familiar with that history and probably chose her words very carefully.
Very carefully, you can imagine, right? And knowing when you would have seen that word emancipation used.
Right. Because it carries so much weight in American history.
Yeah, absolutely. So continues to carry that weight when you use it in your book to kind of describe what's happening in this period. So, I mean, as you just described, right, 1943, kind of the policy changes on paper, but it's sort of a token. But then certainly, right, you have this increase in kind of the way that Asian Americans are imagining kind of what the change in this policy could mean for the future, and kind of where people fit in American society. And so, you also really describe kind of the way that the model minority is a success story of a success story, which, I thought was so helpful because, at the museum, we're every day telling the stories of real people, but then also thinking about the broader stories and narratives about this nation and about different immigrant communities and how those stories have come about, how those stories have shaped the way that both within a community and then outside of a community we understand our past and present. And so this is the era, right? This World War II era when this model minority story starts to come about. Yes. So what does that look like? Kind of what are some of the first kind of seeds of this story starting to form?
Okay. So in thinking about, right, if we think about the model minority concept or myth as a story, right, that gains traction in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, right, first we have the big geopolitical shift. So it's not just World War II, but it is also the Cold War. And the Chinese Civil War, which, in 1949, the communists win and the People's Republic of China is founded. And so then there's another moment where the Chinese and the U.S. are thinking, what is our future, right? And they really cannot really return to China at that time. And so there are a lot of Chinese, especially, I would say, second generation Chinese Americans are really thinking, our future is here in this country. Like now we can imagine that there are more opportunities, but now we're also like geopolitically, it is actually restricted. Like people were going back to China, before World War II, but they're not doing that so much. But then they're also afraid of being thought to be communists or communist sympathizers, right? So there are many layers. And so one storytelling project, we could call it, that comes about in the 1950s, after the United States enters the Korean War, is that U.S. Chinatown leaders decide they're going to be very intentional about projecting an image of Chinese in the U.S. as being anti-communist. And all of that was also then kind of interconnected with really some, again, intentional storytelling efforts. I credit, for instance, one very savvy Chinese-American second-gen journalist out of San Francisco, Charles Leong. So they start really literally telling a story about themselves and releasing sometimes like little publicity bits or publishing them in newspapers about how Chinatowns, especially New York Chinatown, has, it's a model community with model families. So one thing is that with the relaxation of some immigration restrictions, women start to come. So there is a new crop of Chinatown families by the 50s. And these families have the most well-behaved children you can imagine, right? And this is a moment when the country is panicking over juvenile delinquency. I always think about Rebel Without a Cause, like that famous James Dean movie,
right.
And so this is a big problem that all Americans are wrestling with. And alongside, in that mix of this hand-wringing are these stories in major magazines and newspapers, members of Congress talking about these model Chinese American families where the children never get into trouble. They just love to study all the time. They're very well behaved. They always obey their elders. And their families adhere to very strict hierarchies, Confucian hierarchies where young people respect elders, but also there are very strict gender rules, right? So it's very much in line with the conservative vibes, of the mid 20th century, the 1950s. Right.
That sort of focus on a nuclear family.
That's right, exactly. Which is really interesting because actually Chinatown families, were not really like that, but nonetheless, they gained a lot of attention, and I think that's then by the 1960s, as the Black freedom movement ramps up, and then there are these urban uprisings, across the country, places like Watts and so on and so forth, then policymakers are, again, now there's a new crisis where policymakers are like, oh, what do we do? And, really prominent figures like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, right? A famous New York figure. He releases a very controversial report about what he called the Negro family. So it's really about a war on poverty type of report. And in that report, basically faulting structure, like the composition of Black families, many of whom had, women as heads of the household. And again, turning to, in this moment, then Chinatown Chinese American families as one example of a minority group that has had a long history of racial discrimination, and yet somehow has managed to be successful. Many of them still live in these urban areas, Lower East Side Chinatown, but yet their kids are going off to college, and so on. And so these were conversations by social scientists, real serious policymakers. So this was not, I don't think, just people just pulled it out of thin air, but because the groundwork, the seeds of those stories had been laid, with World War II, kind of with the U.S. wanting to welcome Chinese Americans into the fold and celebrating them as fellow Americans. Then the 1950s, by the 1960s, then public figures, journalists and so forth, really then make very explicit comparisons, contrasts between Chinese Americans and Black Americans. So in my book, I say that there's a shift where then the Chinese go from being thought of as they're absolutely not white, not eligible to become citizens. And then by the 1960s, Chinese then are kind of cast as what I called definitively or decidedly not Black. And I think it's that not being Black, even though they're people of color, is really, it's kind of a shorthand for, if Black people represent one kind of failure of American history and life, according to the people of the time, here we have its opposite. And that's, I think, really where you see this model minority, this kind of new rebranding really kind of coming into focus by the 1960s.
Right, and really gelling. And
yes.
Within that framework of kind of what always has been America's racial binary, right, of Black and white. Right. And you sort of trace, how both from within the community and outsiders, that negotiation has to be renegotiated, but still within that framework of
right.
and you call it race making in your book, super
Yeah.
helpful for us to remember how race has been socially constructed, and then how over the course of US history, the ideas about race have shifted, and
Right.
then how, by the 60s, you see this like very distinct comparison and attempted like difference between Chinese Americans and Black Americans. So then, this is this time period, the 1960s, when, of course, we have the Black freedom movement, as you noted, and that, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, as you write about, are trying to figure out like, what the Black freedom movement means for them.
Right.
And so you talk in your book about a particular group trying to decide whether to go on to the March on Washington, which really struck me as a helpful example of some of these debates.
Yeah, so I will also say I'm working on a new project that it continues that thread of it. So one thing about the model minority stereotype is to remember that among the different characteristics is this idea that Asians keep quiet and they don't rock the boat. But the thing is, Asian Americans have also had a long history of civic engagement, political activism. I mean, it's a diverse activism on different, with different positions. But I think there's an irony that in the moment when, going back to World War II, all these conditions that kind of converge to allow for this rebranding of Asian Americans into the model minority, there is also this parallel track where some of the same groups, like the Japanese American Citizens League, for example, who on the one hand are really driving the rebranding, right? That group really pushed Japanese Americans to enlist in the armed forces during World War II, and that was a very controversial position because this is also when Japanese Americans were being incarcerated into camps during the war. But this Japanese American Citizens League is also the same group, I would say, that was at the forefront of entering coalitions and working in solidarity with Black American groups and Jewish American groups and all the kind of left liberal groups that made up the civil rights bloc, right, of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So there is a moment when, JACL, Japanese American Citizens League, they are debating, should we join the March on Washington? They ultimately do. I think that the only Asian American organization that goes as a group. There are other Asian Americans there. But they are also doing a lot of other work to support the passage of the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, fair housing laws. And so there is this very rich history, I think, and maybe really not that well known of Asian American participation in what I would call the rights revolution, including Black civil rights, but also, better treatment for farm workers, right? Filipinos were really active in that with the United Farm Workers and so on. So, I find that history really, really interesting because it does show us what is possible. What is possible when different communities make common cause. I mean, it's really kind of stunning, actually, when you think about that kind of the divergent trajectory. And obviously, they had different histories, these groups, very different histories. The history of slavery and emancipation, as we just talked about. But those stories then become repurposed for new uses, right? And then after the 60s, I like to think that, as a way I explain it, is that this model minority story then it goes viral, and then it becomes very includes all these sort of other new Asian groups that come to the U.S. as immigrants or refugees, after the 1960s. I think this stereotype is still alive and kicking. It's still very prominent today. Even though we could go on and on about all the problems of it, but it is still a very kind of a default way, I would say, that Americans, just without thinking too hard about it, this is kind of where Asians fit into this racial order of this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the way that, that stereotype just kind of can blanket over all of the nuance and difference and diversity within, this huge, huge, huge umbrella of Asian Americans,
Right.
both in the U.S. and then in New York City, right? That now, right, I think Asian Americans, like, there are some of the lowest income New Yorkers are Asian Americans, and then some of the higher income, right? So you have a lot of, income disparity, you have a lot of geographic diversity, and all of that kind of gets flattened out in the face of this stereotype, or can be. So that's why you do the work that you do, and why we do the work that we do, is to look at sort of specific family stories, people's stories, and how those stories can help us complicate some of these myths and stereotypes.
Absolutely. Right.
In our current nation, I mean, those sorts of stories of being able to look at the past and see when people have come together across difference, whether that's class difference or country of origin, ancestors' country of origin, when people are coming together to, push America to live up to its ideals. I find a lot of inspiration in that. I know the stories like that on our tours. We talk about, for the Wongs, the union that Mrs. Wong was in, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And, there were union members. There's this beautiful story that, a son of one of the garment workers tells, where he went to the union picnic, and, he tells it from the perspective of food, right? All the different food. He's like, you can try food from the South, and, there's Chinese food and Puerto Rican food. But how the union was then, the workers were from all these different backgrounds, were members of the union, and were kind of fighting for their rights as workers. That story really inspires a lot of people when we hear that on tours. And so, we sort of see these moments in the past where we can draw inspiration as we think about moving forward, right? And what does moving forward look like?
Yeah, I love that part of the Wong family tour. The union story, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and again, I think that goes back to my model minority in that, what's missing from that stereotypical version is thinking about, well, what are the conditions that allowed for this kind of assimilation, and in her story, her children go off to college, but to me, I took that as, she had a support network of the union structure.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a college savings program. There's
right. And so, again, like structures and institutions, policies matter. And so for me, I'm always interested as a historian, where does kind of policy meet and intersect with ordinary people's lives.
My final question to you, since, at the museum, we are often thinking about kind of what it means to be American, and who has been included in being American, who has been excluded at different moments, and you talk about how sort of the model minority myth kind of questions the boundary lines between inclusion and exclusion. So how do you sort of think about how does that myth sit within the story of inclusion and exclusion?
Yes, I think that's a really important question for all Americans. I think of it as conditional inclusion, right? That there were conditions that made better life chances possible for Chinese in the United States. That was actually World War II, and then strangely, the Cold War, but also changing immigration policies. Desegregation of education and housing, affirmative action and employment opportunities. And so those certain kinds of conditions have to line up to make it possible. But also conditions don't always work in your favor, right? That they can also create situations where then people are find themselves in really negative circumstances. I'll give you a more recent example. I think for many people, certainly in New York and elsewhere during the pandemic, because of that association with COVID-19 and China, that many Asians in the United States who look Chinese were felt some hostility, sometimes violence aimed at them, and people just were on edge, So to me, that you could be both considered a minority, but then somebody from that same group experiencing, you know, real deep hostility and negative treatment. To me, I think really kind of shows the conditional nature of that inclusion.
And certainly how the work of inclusion is constant work and work that should be all of our responsibility. I mean, that's sort of what I take from that as at our museum, we tell the stories of, 12 different families over 120 years and thinking about how, there has been this kind of continual work within communities to work for their inclusion and how that requires constant.
I think it does.
Constant work.
It is. It's its own labor. Yeah.
And for those of us from outside of the community
right.
also needing to do that work.
I think so. Yeah. I think the storytelling is a part of that work. A really important part. So thank you for
Absolutely.
this opportunity.
Thank you for sharing your research with us. And we'll turn it over to questions from the audience now.
Great.
Hey, there we go. Oh, there we go. All right. Hi, Dr. Wu. Thank you for joining us last month, and thank you for joining us tonight. It was so enlightening to get to watch that again, and would love to hear what questions the audience has. So I'll actually turn it over to Dolan to share a question that we've gotten already, and then feel free as you have more questions to please just share them in the chat.
Thanks, Kat. I really, really like that video. There's so many really wonderful images and a lot that even I haven't seen. So we do have one question. Barbara just would ask if you could talk a little bit more about the restrictions specifically, during the exclusion era, used to keep Chinese families from reuniting, from bringing their families over, specifically about the paper sons phenomenon.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Dolan and Kat and Annie and all the folks at the museum for hosting me on a really terrific visit and tour of the Wong family apartment. And it's such an honor, one of my most favorite museums, to join you and all of you tonight during this crazy, snowstorm. Um, so the question is asking a little bit more detail about the kinds of restrictions that Chinese families face. Sure. There were different levels of restriction, I think, at like local, state, as well as federal. I do know there's a new book out by Professor Beth Lou Williams at Princeton. I think that goes into a lot of that in great detail if you're interested. But I do think the restrictions aim to be quite comprehensive in terms of restricting the freedoms and opportunities for immigrants from China. So I think some of the biggest ones would be bars to naturalized citizenship. So if you did come from China, one was not eligible to become a naturalized citizen, right? And that is a huge blow because of, again, having some voice and say over, what I would call governing power, right? Over the kinds of laws and policies that structure American society. But I will also say that, Chinese did challenge a lot of these types of restrictions in court. And so a very famous one, I think that is on a lot of people's minds right now, is a court challenge to, who had access to what's called birthright citizenship. If, the idea that if you are born on United States soil, you are automatically considered a US citizen. And that came with the 14th Amendment, and which, came into being, in the age of emancipation after the Civil War. But the question of did that apply to the Chinese wasn't made clear until this lawsuit by a young man named Wong Kim Ark. He was born and raised in San Francisco. He was a cook. I think he left California to go visit his family in China. On the way back into the US, he was detained at the border and not allowed in. And so he sued, the United States. And he won his case at the Supreme Court level. And so that was a huge victory, not only for Chinese Americans, but for all people, right? Of course, now you fast forward now to the time we are in today, that question has been reopened, and it isn't exactly clear what will happen, but it is has long, I think has um, I think for a long time people thought that was a settled law, but now it has become unsettled. So that is just one example. There's another famous case that went up to the Supreme Court level, and it was about Chinese laundries. There was a Chinese laundry in San Francisco called Yik Wo, and the sheriff and the city government of San Francisco, they were singling out laundries owned by Chinese operators for unequal treatment, right? They would face certain kinds of fines or restrictions that owners of laundries who were not Chinese did not have to deal with. So the Chinese laundry owners, they sued, and they also won that case at the Supreme Court level, and that really sort of firmed up the rights that all people, regardless of citizenship, have under the 14th Amendment, under the Constitution, right? So that, of course, again, is a very precious constitutional right that right now I think we're seeing a lot of instability, but again, something that is foundational, I think, to guaranteeing freedom and opportunity and equality, right? So those are just a couple of standout examples that I hope answers your question.
Thank you so much. And I'm getting a couple questions directly, and I do want to say if you'd prefer to message hosts and panelists questions you have directly, feel free to do that.
Mhm.
We have a question that asks if you think that the model minority myth, is it still a source of pressure for Asian American kids in this country?
Oh, I definitely thank you for that question. Yes, I think that is very much the case that the model minority myth, again, sounding to be very positive, but actually having all kinds of, negative, I would say, implications or harmful ones. There's certainly a whole body of research and reporting that demonstrates how it's not, it does, there are, for some Asian American young people, students, even I think adults, there is a lot of kind of expectation, I guess, that sometimes is an unhealthy kind of pressure, And so, an easy way to access some of this, honestly, if you look in like Google Scholar, right? Google Scholar is one of the parts of Google that you can look up different kinds of publications and academic scholarship. And I think if you just type in model minority myth or model minority, you'll see lots and lots of hits. I think there's no end to it's a great wealth of research on this topic. And just one other data point, I have a colleague here at Indiana University, Joel Wong. One of his, he's in counseling psychology. That's his research specialty. And I know that, I've heard his presentations on. He talks a lot about, Asian Americans having very high suicide rates, for example, and some of those kinds of pressures feeding into these public health concerns.
Hmm. The next question, one of our viewers noticed Daniel Inouye in the photo of Johnson signing the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1965. Good eye.
Mhm.
And wondering if there's been a lot of like research or books or papers published about his legacy and his sort of history of advocacy on the issue.
hmm Thank you. Yeah, I think Daniel Inouye is a really important figure. I had the chance a few years ago to research some of his papers at the University of Hawaii. So, if you're ever in Hawaii, there's some great archives out there. I would say actually in this book that The Color of Success, I do talk about Daniel Inouye and his importance in some ways as a symbolic figure, really as kind of the model minority, right, of the 1960s, right? A Japanese American who, during this time of extreme racial discrimination and marginalization, right, during World War II, I mean, he was from Hawaii, but he was one of the volunteers essentially to the U.S. Army, and during his time on the European front, he lost his right arm in battle, and then that kind of turned him from his career that he wanted to be a doctor, and then he ended up going into law, which is how he ended up going into politics. And so I think by the late 1960s, when he's serving as a member of Congress, I would say he was probably the most famous Asian American of the time. And there's this really interesting scenario in the 1968 Democratic National Convention where he's like one of the big keynote speakers, and he really addresses very head on this mono minority stereotype. And he talks to, he kind of says, people ask me, why can't Black Americans be more like Japanese Americans? Like he literally brings up this comparison, and he talks about how that isn't actually a fair comparison because Black Americans and Japanese Americans have very different histories, So there is a bit about that, certainly in my writing. And if you're interested, just in his own words, Daniel Inouye published a memoir. I think it was called Journey to Washington, and that came out in the 1960s as well. And as a primary source, it's a really interesting text, a memoir that does tell really in a lot of ways a model, even as in a way is conscious of the problems of that model minority comparison. I think in some ways his own story of his life affirms it. Yeah. So there's this like kind of inherent tension in there.
We have another question. If you could speak more about the experience that Chinese American students had in schools. Did they experience segregation in the same way as
Mhm.
Black students, or, was it a little bit, right? What was their experience, especially during this period of like the 1880s to the 1960s?
Oh, sure. Okay. So, yes, absolutely. Chinese students experienced racial segregation in the U.S. school systems. There's some famous cases. I mentioned historian May Nai earlier. She wrote a book called The Lucky Ones. It is about the Tape, Tape family of San Francisco. And I'm a little rusty, but I think it is about a school segregation case and how the Tape family challenged, this school segregation of Chinese American children in San Francisco. In Mississippi, I believe in the 1920s, there was another challenge to racial segregation of Chinese in schools. And so, it's this. In a case like Mississippi, it becomes then very interesting because in the Jim Crow South, right, there's just this very stark black-white binary, like literally, right? And so there's so many, I think, stories from historical sources of even people like Daniel Inouye, talking about just when they go to places like the US South and literally like get on the bus, like they don't know which part of the bus to sit in, or, it's just or which drinking fountain to use, which bathroom to use. So there are, I think there are, yes, so to answer that. But I will say this, in my research for the book, I found something else that really piqued my interest. In the 1960s in Boston, as Boston was being ordered to desegregate its public school system, the Boston, essentially the school board, right? They were trying to figure out what to do I mean, I think they were not entirely open to desegregation. And so one thing they thought they could try to a little workaround is to reclassify it was like 671 Chinese students as white, or they called it white with an asterisk. And so I thought, well, that's so interesting that the Chinese in Boston in the 1960s have at least enough racial ambiguity that it's even possible to think about moving them into this white category, and that is, that really got me started down this whole entire rabbit hole of wondering things like, how did, how did this desegregation and affirmative action policies, what was the role and place of Asian Americans in that story? And that's the research project I'm finishing up now.
Hmm. That's actually where I wanted to transition us to close out the conversation. Thank you all so much for your questions. I'm sorry we don't have time to get to exactly all of them, but your answers, Dr. Wu, actually did touch on some of the other things that were coming up. People curious about sort of how Chinese people were denoted racially on the census. So I think your answer sort of looking at this community in Boston and how they're sort of advocating for a certain categorization is super helpful to think about how those census categories change over time and how that shapes people's experience. And then also someone wondering about the experience of Japanese Americans in the same era that we were talking about Chinese Americans. So for that person, and really for all of you, I highly encourage you to purchase and read The Color of Success. It is available with a discount from the Tenement Museum shop using the code BookTalk. So please go buy Dr. Wu's current book. And then if we could close out, tell us about your next book, which is coming out. What did you say this year? Next year?
Hopefully, maybe in a year or so. Yes. So the new
Yes.
book is thank you for asking. It's about a history of Asian Americans and racial justice. I call it a surprising history, again, because of this whole model minority stereotype that I think a lot of people don't even realize that there is this political history of Asian Americans, but Asian Americans at the time. So the story again begins in World War II, but I take it up through essentially 2025, that because Asian Americans were hoping, or because the the rights revolution, right? Not just the Black freedom movement, but that expanded to include other groups, that created an opening and opportunity for Asian Americans to claim new kinds of rights and opportunities available to minorities, such as affirmative action. But because of that model minority assumption, it was often very difficult for Asian Americans uh, to make the case that they were what I call beleaguered minorities, right? So there's this kind of uncertainty, like, do they really have problems or don't they? And so that's not just like this kind of stereotype anymore, but I think what I want to show in this book is how it then translated to actual policy making or efforts to move the needle in policy making. So I have a whole, what I call an ecosystem of Asian American influencers from World War II and a lot of different case studies on different issues, everything from employment to hate crimes, to school desegregation, college admissions, all these kinds of things. And also showing a diversity of Asian American ideological and political positions, right? So there's everybody from like the whole kind of ideological spectrum. And that is, I think something really important to remember about Asian Americans, like all Americans, right? We contain multitudes, and that does make the work of common cause often challenging.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And right, I think that's what I really appreciate about The Color of Success. And it sounds like your new book will have that same range of just featuring stories of such a diverse set of people who all kind of are under this identity umbrella that the U.S. has of Asian American, and you really kind of help us start to untangle that through these stories that you share of real people and their work to make a more inclusive United States. So thank you so much, Dr. Wu, for joining us last month, for joining us tonight. Thanks to all of you for your questions and your comments. We will have one more Tenement Tuesday next week. Then we'll take a little pause and be back a little later this season with more of this particular format. We hope you'll join us. We hope you will purchase Dr. Wu's book. And I should tell you what next week is about. Next week is actually really connected to tonight's conversation. but looking at the perspective of Jewish Americans and name-changing practices, and how that also connects us into sort of this era of World War II into the civil rights movement. So please join us next week with historian Kirsten Vermaaglich. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Wu, for your incredible work. And I look forward to reading your upcoming book too.
Everybody for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it.
All right. Take care. Good night, everyone. And thank you, Dolan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dolan. Thank you, Kat.